The Stella Cinema was our local cinema in Mount Merrion in Dublin, and throughout my childhood, on wet weekends or holidays, our mother would put a shilling in each of our hands, packing us off to the matinee, anything for a peaceful afternoon. Off we'd head, relinquishing the shilling and joining what felt like a horde of our peers similarly ousted from home. I remember the mayhem and the chaos created by kids running circuits, leaping seats, fighting their way along the queues for ice cream from the unfortunate women standing with shelves of ice cream precariously attached to their necks by two seemingly fragile straps. There was spitting over the balcony and the firing of unsavoury projectiles at any available target. I can remember only a scattering of the films from those days, which is a marvel since watching the movie was the very last thing that any of us were there to do. Time moved on, and as that same cohort of the neighbourhood's children graduated to teenage status, the ante was upped. The Stella became charged with a different sort of energy entirely. The boys eyeing the girls eyeing the boys, hormones palpably sitting on the stifled air. There was a shifting of seats, and there was also a shifting in seats. It was steamy and intensely exciting. As fate would have it, it was on one of those cinema outings that an incident occurred that was to be life-altering for me. Like all those epic biblical stories, this Damascenes experience involved a beam of light. In this case, the beam of light was emitted from the cinema manager's torch, landing and lingering on my own and my friend Catherine's faces. It was not that flitting movement that says quiet down and then moves on to another row of seats. The beam of light remained steadily on us and then pointed a path along the floor of our row towards the aisle. So up we stood, following the torchlight to the aisle, and then up the aisle and towards the brighter lights of the foyer. At which point the manager guided us to the outer doors of the cinema, and under the dimly lit overhang informed us that we were now barred. Now you can choose to believe me or not, but I can't, nor have I ever understood what warranted such a heavy hand. It may well be so unspeakably awful that it is repressed and stored deeply in my unconscious, or it may well have been so frivolous as to make it unworthy of committing to memory. I think myself it was a miscarriage of justice. But there we were, ousted. Well, what do stroppy teenagers with some nerve do in some such circumstances? The flames slowly fanned the rage, the outrage, the indignity, the nerve of him. We would not take this. We would show him. We would report him to the owner, we decided. We would make a formal complaint. And so it was that we walked with purpose to the nearest telephone box, and using the huge, dog-eared, filthy, well-scribbled-on telephone directory, we located the number of the Stella. We called and asked to speak to the owner, Mr. O'Grady, who actually did come to the phone, whereupon we lodged our complaint in what I would like to think was a coherent, logically thought out and even manner. He listened, said he'd look into it, and we felt triumphant. Well, as it happened, that sense of triumph was very short-lived, because my parents liked to go to what they called the flicks, and the Stella was their go-to venue, where over time they had developed a familiar relationship with the manager. So about 10:30 one night, on return from their night at the flicks, my father called me downstairs. His tactics lacking any sense of measure, with a rolled up newspaper in his hand, flicking me around the back of the head, repeatedly asking the question, "What do you mean by it?" There was no space for an answer, just this question ringing repeatedly in the air. The shame of it. The whole house was in turmoil. I had some nerve. What did I mean by it? Now you're wondering what provoked such a drastic and in some ways violent response to what in the scheme of things was an offence that warranted some sanction, fair enough, but one commensurate with the crime, not the immediate one or what was to come later. But the thing is this, I was a persistently problematic child and then teenager. At home, where my mother, for as long as I can remember, told me I was far too frank for my own good, and at school, where at parent-teacher meetings the nuns described me as insolent. One of them, who I really do believe liked me, added, "Sometimes it takes me everything not to slap her face, such is the level of her insolence." In a fragmented, unhappy and dysfunctional family, it was I, the proverbial middle child, who would name the issues at home, only to be shot down as cheeky, outspoken, the one with the nerve. I was a delinquent of sorts, and during my teenage years, a frizzing ball of rage. I didn't fit the home devil, street angel profile. I was, it seemed, a fairly consistent devil regardless of location. Home and school were one thing, but when my stroppiness spilled out into our middle-class, tight community where social standing mattered more than it might to my parents, the die was cast. And when I was still basking in the glory of myself and Catherine being the first girls ever barred from the local cinema, my parents were somewhere else. The shame and the exposure were intolerable. This was endgame stuff. Over breakfast in a calmer atmosphere a few weeks later, the question was asked, would you like to go to boarding school? Well, contrary to what you might think, this was met internally with some excitement. It took only a fleeting moment to realise that I was being handed a way out from what was not the happiest of homes. My parents had consulted the nuns, and again, contrary to where your mind may be going, I liked the nuns in my Dublin day school, and as fate would have it, they just happened to run a boarding school in County Mayo. And so that following September, I was put on a train in West Lindrow in Dublin with a scattering of other East Coasters and dispatched westwards across the country, disembarking in Ballina, where the nuns transferred us to cars, which carried us even further west to the shores of Lough Conn and to Gertner Abbey, where I was to spend some of the happiest and most positive years of my life. The nuns belonged to a fairly rare breed of an order who did act as their vocations might suggest. And as I suspected from my time with them in Dublin, they actually loved us. They encouraged us, affirmed, celebrated, and challenged us. And over time, the inner fight and the rage began to subside. It wasn't a miraculous transition. Many a dark night I would sit as a result of some misdemeanor outside the door of Mother Superior in a row of seats reserved for offenders. I would wait for my slot where over a glass of milk and a biscuit in a cozy dark office, she would take me on a tour of my crazed mind and soul. And over time, and thankfully maintaining some of my fighting spirit, I bowed to an easier internal world. 8 years later, on entering the social work arena as a residential social worker, I met my past self full on, time and again, in the shape of Lydia, Paula, Christine, and Sonia, to name just a handful of the raging teenage girls whom I recognized instinctively. And it often seemed to me that that recognition was mutual. Hands on hips, spitting rage, are stepping so far into my personal space, screaming in my face their objection to rules or decisions that they fought against. And when they were spent with fighting and raging, they'd often sit sobbing about what they could not understand, trying to make sense of their lives, hurts, relationships, disappointments, and what they viewed as personal injustices. It's not lost on me that when I got to the point in my life where it was felt that I was beyond parental control, that I was packed off to boarding school. Had the decks been stacked differently, I may have ended up in the care system that I was drawn to working around for my entire career. "You've got a nerve" was the standard response to my fighting self during those early years, but that took on a different hue some years later. At a 3-week-long therapeutic group event gloriously situated in the hills overlooking Siena in Tuscany, the group therapist, a huge Jewish New Yorker, asked me a question as the group process began. He asked, "Are you a woman of courage?" I thought on it, strangely not an adjective I ever considered applying to myself. And after trying on the adjective for a few moments, I answered in the affirmative. His simple response was, Well, use your courage to confront your fear. It's strange how reframing the narrative can alter that narrative significantly. How would this new perspective, my past fighting, my kicking against the traces, my being the one with some nerve, took on a different patina? That exquisite layer that develops on older surfaces, a hue that is softer, more appealing, more attractive, more accessible. I think of all the young women I've known, the Lydias, the Paulas, the Christinas, the Sonias. It's easy to dismiss them, the nerve of them, but perhaps more hopeful to think of them simply as young women of courage who, if given the right opportunity, can use that courage to confront their fears.